Okay, everybody, hello. It's time for the Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Very happy to be here. Very happy to share this conversation with you. Today we're talking with Nathan Tankus. Nathan is someone who is getting a lot of attention these days. He's got a profile up on Bloomberg News this week that's talking about him as a kind of prophet, a kind of guru, someone who knows a lot about the way the economy works and writes about it on his Substack, which is called Notes on the Crises by Nathan Tankus. You know, we here at Nostalgia Trap are very proud to have spotted Nathan and spotted his talent a few years ago. We had him on episode 47. You can go back to June 2016 in the Nostalgia Trap archives on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get it. And listen to it because Nathan knew what was going on. We talked with him right before Trump was elected. And he just has a very particular command of the way things work. And I think it's really fascinating to listen to him. And obviously a lot of people feel that way. His Substack is now something that people from all sorts of big institutions, big, important, powerful people follow Nathan's emails and listen to what he has to say about the things that are happening, particularly his latest kind of entries into talking about COVID-19 and what was happening with that. So he's just, well-deserved attention, I think, towards Nathan's work. So we had a conversation about a lot of things, but I mainly wanted to talk to him about this article he wrote recently in the American Prospect, in which he talked about Black Lives Matter and the riots and sort of the political utility of riots and property destruction. So that got us started thinking about, where we're at right now. And again, it's just really fun to see Nathan's success because he really deserves it. And speaking of that, if you want to get in on Nathan's Substack, he set up, he was very, very kind to set up a special discount link for Nostalgia Trap listeners. So he's offering a 50% off subscription to his financial prognostications and ideas about politics. And I think they're well worth it. And obviously, a lot of people think so. So if you want to go over to nostalgiatrap.com, in the extended episode description there's a link to a discount for Nostalgia Trap listeners on Nathan Tankus's Substack, which is called Notes on the Crises. Really, really great stuff. So thank you, Nathan, for joining us. And if you want to support our stuff, we're at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. It's really, really important that we have supporters because that's the really increasingly a central part of my income as academic work dries up under the pandemic. So if you can throw a few dollars our way, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and we've got bonus material, vibe checks, all sorts of pop culture episodes on there if you are interested. And thanks so much for the people that are already doing that. All right. I hope you enjoy this talk. Here is me with the incredible Nathan Tankus. All right, Nathan, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a long time. I think it's been, we were just saying, I think it's been since you were on the show in 2016. Is that right? Somewhere around there?
Yeah. It was I think it's around this time, actually, 4 years ago.
Wow.
I remember it being hot. It was like May or June 2016. We talked about the 2016 election. I always think about it. Actually, super grateful for having that episode because it puts me on the record with my view at a crucial turning point, and I feel pretty good about what I had on the record then.
Vindicated by history. We love when that happens.
Yeah, it's just there's nothing like describing the contours of how an election is going to play out to a T, and then it happens, and you have the playback to
I told you.
That sounds eerie.
That's great. I mean, that's one of the reasons it's funny. I already got to this phrase "vindicated by history" because, in part, that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you, Nathan. You've had tremendous success. It seems like in recent moments. I've caught your name online in so many different contexts. And what's the name? Where can people find you? Just to start us off, where can people find you? Because it seems like you've gotten a lot of attention for your writing about economics in particular. But I just want to thank you because I think of you as a guy that just has a great perspective on the left, so you can help us untangle what's going on. But where can people find you?
Sure. My My Substack is where my newsletter, but using the site Substack is just my name, nathantankus.substack.com.
Cool.
Yeah, so I mean, the story of that basically is obviously I've written for here and there for outlets, and been putting my opinions out there online for a long time, but I reached a certain moment in March, a little, I would not too far ahead, but a little further ahead than everyone else, about coronavirus. Not just that it was going to be this, a pandemic, a huge health crisis, but specifically that it had economic implications. There was a moment, the weekend, the like second weekend of March, like March 9th, when interest rates, when we can get into why this meant something to me, interest rates had fallen a ton on government securities, especially the long maturity government securities, and going, okay, why is this going on? And then looking around, realizing that we were in for that people speculators, that Wall Street types expected we were going to be in a at the very least a big recession, and then examining why that was and realizing this is much bigger and much more serious than people are even realizing it. Realizing about a health time. March 9th, people were still focusing somewhat on the primary. Super Tuesday had just happened, and it was like, oh, will Bernie be able to come back?
That's right.
The second, it was Super Tuesday 2.0. And at that moment, I had just completely forgotten about the election, because it was clear to me that all that stuff was irrelevant, that now we're in a completely different world. And the week after, I realized people really weren't really writing about it or communicating what was going on to more generally and bringing a bigger picture to what was happening. And so I decided to start writing about it myself, and started the Substack and started writing about it, for that first month, almost every weekday. And that, that kind of just exploded on its own, because suddenly, as everyone's realizing that this crisis is happening, looking for someone to comment on it, and I was there kind of a little bit earlier than other people, trying to cover all the different angles.
Well, I'm so glad that that you got the attention for that, because it's weird. It's like it's part of the like media world right now. It's like things are happening like this, and you have the sense that, like, especially, I think you're right, during those final weeks of reality, of the old reality, that at the beginning of March, I think March 12th was where I stopped going to class, and that was the end of my like being in the world, and it accelerated really quickly. But you had this feeling that, like, I don't know, that there were things happening that the mainstream was not catching up to, and all of a sudden, you had these voices, and you were one of them, but there are others, there are others too. They are like these awful like libertarians that write their Medium posts about coronavirus and everything, and they get a lot of attention too. Like, in other words, there's almost like this thirst for people to find like the real what's going on, for like voices that are actually commentating in like in real time, and you definitely benefited from that because of your economic analysis. I mean, it's weird because I'm not a person that's well versed in the terms of the science of capitalism in the way you are, and so when I hear these things, I'm just kind of like, I'm often trying to kind of filter them through the like the larger kind of pop cultural understandings of them, and one of them is like, oh well. The stock market, when the stock market crashes, that means things are bad. And when it's up, that means things are good. And it seems like this moment has been like almost separated the health of the society from the stock market, if that makes sense. Like, it just seems like...
I mean, I think in general, the stock market is usually just very separated.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, under commented things on it is it's not just like about Wall Street in general being separated from the real economy, but it's about the specific people who are on these trading desks who are trading stocks are really separated from what's going on in the society. Like I said, even for me, someone who's paying attention, I had other things going on in my life. It was interest rates collapsing, one opening of trading or pre-market trading that made me realize what was going on. That was the thing that sort of like got me out of whatever other stuff I was focusing on. And it's because, these are also, largely Wall Street people, but they're focusing on a different thing. They're focusing on interest rates. And interest rates are much more directly about what the Federal Reserve is doing. And the Federal Reserve is this unique governmental actor that's focusing on what's going on in quote unquote the real economy. As much as you have problems, or I have plenty of problems with how they operate and have different types of criticisms, especially from the left, whatever you think of them, they are focused on inflation and unemployment and financial stability. Those are their main focuses of what's going on in the world. And so market actors who are trying to predict what the Federal Reserve are doing are themselves looking at these real economic variables. Whereas people who are trading stocks are just looking about profits. They're just looking about profits, and they're not only that, but they're looking at profits, over a large horizon. Thinking, a lot of what's going on right now is, traders are creating this conventional wisdom among each other about the economy recovering a year, 2, 3 years from now, and there being big profits for large companies,
right?
Which are, after all, large companies are the only companies on the stock market, and that narrative is what's led the stock market to do well, even as the society is imploding. So it's like, I would say it's not just like in general Wall Street being separated from the quote unquote real economy or how our society actually works, but it's specifically these specific kind of frat boys who trade just as much on what happened in the Sunday's football game than anything else, that and are driven by these simplistic narratives and don't have to understand how the Federal Reserve actually operates or how any kind of real world economic institution operates. They just have to play on this game of narratives about future profits, and as we all know, corporate profits don't necessarily have anything to do with anything else. Like the stock market can go up, even if people are predicting everything else is going to implode, but big companies are gonna benefit from everything imploding and 30% unemployment because they'll dig into the former small businesses market share. It's narratives like that can drive a stock market trader to have things going up, even if if the U.S. posts 10,000 more deaths that day. And it doesn't have anything to do with anything. So I mean, for my as an economics person, you always, and you're talking to people who are not versed in economics, the first thing you always say is don't pay attention to the stock market. And if you're going to look at any market indicator, look at interest rates. The interest rates are generally going to be much more informative about what's going on in your life than the stock market any day of the week. And even more, even better, don't even look at that stuff at all and actually look at unemployment rate.
Well, I mean, that's why I think you're such an important figure in a lot of ways, because you're in that New York left scene, and you're sort of, I see your name appearing in a lot of the places that I'm looking, but at the same time, you're one of the voices that's speaking about economic issues and economic structures. And I know you talk about MMT, which is what modern monetary theory, and all that seems like it's almost like the left has not generally been concerned about that stuff. It hasn't been like a big part of what the left is doing. A lot of the left's focus, especially during the kind of lead up to the Bernie primaries, just been about focusing on policies of redistribution and things like that in a very sort of old school Democrat way. But I'm wondering, what was the fulcrum for you? Because it sounds like, in other words, how did your thinking shift about what's happening economically in the on the left, whatever, during this Bernie primary? Where were you before coronavirus during the Bernie primary? Were you a Bernie bro? And how much were you seeing Bernie as a transformative, a transformative figure within the left? Because it seems like that, like you said, when coronavirus came, all of it dried up really quickly. It just kind of the election just faded away as important. How were you kind of conceiving that before we got to the coronavirus moment?
I mean, I still think, I was definitely thinking that Bernie was important, and was somewhat focused on Bernie. I in general was kind of I first of all spent most of the time not thinking that Bernie was going to win.
Yeah,
my
right.
running hypothesis in 2019, which ended up not being the case, of course, but was still him losing nonetheless, was him getting a plurality of the vote and then getting getting picked, someone else getting picked at the convention.
Like what happened in 2016, kind of, a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit like that. I thought it was going to be something like that based on how things were going. And then for like a week in there was that moment where it seemed like he might be able to pull it together. And and in fairness, it took really extraordinary and fast moving action on basically former President Obama to stop that. I mean, you needed a lot of rapid and almost unprecedented dropouts and consolidation around barely functioning Biden to make that happen, which in a lot of ways is extraordinary. But
Obama made the golden phone call.
Yeah,
and it seems like that was right around the time where the coronavirus thing was just exploding.
Yeah, that's the other thing that in retrospect is so crazy. It's just like, I remember at the time thinking it was crazy that, and even though not processing the full gravity, but thinking it was crazy that it was like they spent like the first like half an hour on like Bernie and anti-communism, and then like 40 minutes after like 2 commercial breaks to finally said, what do you guys all think about coronavirus? And in fairness to that moment, partially it's because it took a lot of people a lot of time realizing it, but coronavirus was a time, is a perfect example for Medicare for all and making the case for Medicare for all.
Right.
It's something I wrote about early on, that it's actually like it's forget it being the proper health response to an emergency. It's also the proper fiscal response to what's going on. You get the deficit spending, you get the government spending that you need when you need it from this system. Whereas in our current system, people lose their jobs, which means the government is now suddenly not spending money that it spends on employer subsidies, and so much of our government healthcare spending is required from state and local governments, that they also have this pressure on their budgets and are looking to slash healthcare spending like Cuomo was, right when you need healthcare spending the most. So it's actually just like a badly designed structure, even just from a sort of basic governmental functioning point of view. And it is striking to me that in retrospect, I'm not saying that I had the foresight to think about it at the time, that wasn't on the radar of an argument, a talking point for Medicare for all. It wasn't part of the case. And now it just seems obvious that our system that requires private and state and local fiscal support to healthcare spending is just not a good structure to respond to crises. And it just seems obvious that putting all that quote unquote burden on the federal government is just the most effective way to respond to crises. And that was not part of the conversation. And you can imagine Bernie in that moment using that one debate to pivot to that, and would have very quickly seemed prophetic if he had done so.
It's so fucking tragic too, because it's like, I mean, most of me is like kind of just like, the Bernie moment fizzled out and that's it. And I know there was a lot of fucking Democratic Party malfeasance as usual around that, but at the same time, I'm like, God, it's such a perfect moment for Bernie's politics, because it seems like the place
well, yes
where
and no.
Yeah. Maybe not Black Lives Matter. Maybe not that part of it.
And that's the huge key thing, is that like his race analysis has gotten better in the last 4 years, but Bernie still just like, he doesn't have the instinct for the moment. And he I mean, the stuff he put out recently on police reform.
Oh my God!
Like paying cops more because we give them so many jobs, rather than just taking those critical jobs away from these armed
Dude.
bureaucrats to do.
He's such a frustrating, like, mainstream Democrat sometimes. You know what I mean? Like, he sometimes, when it comes down to certain issues, like, you know, and that's really the end point of American politics in a lot of ways. That mainstream politics for me are things like the police or Israel. And he's just awful on issues like that when he speaks to them. And, like, sometimes he's better than others, but at the same time, he's pretty much squarely within the Democratic Party.
This is why, like, actually win or lose, I have not been and have not been particularly invested in Bernie, because, you know, ultimately, you know, as much as I can like a politician, you know, on the individual level, or like stuff they say, a politician is, and this is something you really get more when you get into policy, a politician is only as good as their staff. And Bernie has never been very good at building a good staff, a staff that challenges him, a staff that's innovative, that thinks outside the box. He's here and there picked up good policies. I think especially actually in corporate law and antitrust, I think he's been particularly good and kind of brought like more of a left vision to those spaces than generally there is. But on the whole, his ability to build a staff to comprehensively, you know, tackle different policies, I felt very mixed on. And an example the other way, where you can have someone who's like in every way a milquetoast politician, but if they have a good staff can do big things, is Michael Bennett. You know, we all remember, if you remember the Democratic primary at all, which I do not complain if someone doesn't. Michael Bennett was like one of the most boring, forgettable white guys on that stage, saying the most boring centrist stuff. But Michael Bennett and his staff are the people who put adding an additional $600 a week onto unemployment insurance. It's his people who put that out there, who forcefully fought of it, and of course, you know, Bernie picked it up and ran with it and defended it against Republicans. But you know, it's not clear to me that if his staff hadn't put that in, that we would have had that, you know, clear, one of the most progressive, you know, policies in terms of the social safety net that's been passed in decades.
Yeah, and
even if it's time limited, and I think it probably will be extended. It just, you know.
He wasn't able like to respond in a fluid way to the situation, it seemed like. It felt like for his 2020 run, he just kept doing the same boilerplate speech about billionaires at all the different and you know, it got to the point where it felt like everyone's heard this. You know, where are you kind of like getting more dynamic and reaching out to new voters and sort of like, you know, responding to the situation in real time rather than that kind of hitting that kind of old school 3 points of economic inequality that, you know, I think is resonant and important. But at the same time, like, I mean, you know, I wanted to ask you about this specifically about healthcare, because it seems like, you know, on the healthcare issue, at least the Medicare for all, you know, prophetic, correct, because like, you know, the idea of attaching healthcare to employment seems really sillier and more insane than ever now when we're facing just like unbelievable levels of unemployment during a pandemic. It seems like absolutely just so fucking clear that we shouldn't have it that way. I wonder, like, you know, was Bernie making that connection? Was Bernie saying, like, you know, separating it from employment? How much was his healthcare program?
Not really. I mean, like, not in the specific way that like attaching it to employment is like a clear and present danger in a recession or depression. That's not something that came out of his people. And in fairness to him, that's not something that has really been put out there from economic analysts, including from the left. You know, I started tweeting about it a little bit last year, and then of course started writing about it during the coronavirus suppression. But it hasn't been a foot forward argument that has been made there. But that's also precisely the point. Is like, you know, Bernie has, you know, gotten a ton more access to resources since his 2016 run. You know, he's been made this, you know, gigantic national figure in politics. You know, and thoughts, ideology are important, you know, domain in which you can test things, and it's not. I don't really think he's taken the full advantage that you could have. Like, we could have like a Bernie Sanders think tank, like that actually has a staff that is independent from the normal networks of think tanks, that could be working together collectively to work on things, and that is beyond what here and there left commentators, even like what I can do with a Substack. It's not just like individuals out there putting out ideas. It's about collectivities who can, as a team, can produce things. I mean, that's the whole dirty secret irony of neoliberalism, is that it's so powerful precisely because it is a collective, collaborative project.
Right.
That people work together to perfect and make better all the time.
Well, is that out there though? I mean, that's part of what I think the question was. Like, there was this constant refrain from a lot of Bernie's like most vocal supporters that there was this kind of army of young Bernie people who were just going to like come into the system and just overthrow it. And we know, we've heard that before, like that kind of generational politics that like the youth is coming and the youth surge is coming, but it seems like liberal Republicans are gonna be like the ones that end up like swinging the election to Biden, or at least like some sort of like other crew of people. And that part of it was like, I don't know, when you think, in other words, like when Black Lives Matter explodes onto the streets after the George Floyd killing the last few weeks, I was like, well, there's what the Bernie people were imagining the Bernie people were. You know what I mean? Like there was like, in other words, like there's this misjudgment of where the political energy really is, and that part of it seems like it's when the Black Lives Matter thing really kind of like showed its strength over the last few weeks. I felt like that gave the lie to the Bernie thing more than ever. I could be reading that wrong though. Yeah.
I mean, like the thing about a lot of people make a lot about people under 40, especially under 30, voting for Bernie, but like those are of the people who are voting first.
Right.
But second, and we talk about and criticize lesser evil politics all the time, but Bernie's better than a lot of that, and like is like something, does have some affirmative vision that draws people in. But for a lot of people, he is a lesser evil. He is the moderate milquetoast. Hey, if you guys want us to do this, bloodlessly, cleanly, nice and comfortably with just a little, few tax rate increases here and there, go with the Bernie option. Bernie is the nice little gift that we can give you where we can get a better world, and all you had to do was like listen to like a loud Jew sometimes
right.
on television. Like, it's a low cost. It's a low cost. Whereas, our alternative to Bernie is much more raucous and riveting and, also just affirmatively exciting than Bernie is in a lot of ways. Yeah, I do think that there is a network of people that Bernie could have drawn on, in terms of like.
Yeah, I'm wondering why that didn't happen.
Taking government, but it's still scattered and bare bones, and the left generally just has not taken that seriously as a project. Partially, it's just we don't have institutions in general. We don't have a newspaper. We don't have these other things that we are kind of paying dues with our money. Usually, labor unions, of course, are the institutions that historically organize around and produce that. And so, but in general, I think the left kind of doesn't has felt ambivalent about creating the institutional capacity to produce a program.
That's an old school problem, man. I mean, I talked to all these like, I talked to all these like 60s radicals that are, walking around kind of like, shell shocked for the last 50 years. And many of them express that. They're like, we should have built some lasting institutions. But there's like this sort of like this lament that's always like, well, we didn't know. And we were caught up in the chaos of the moment. And I wonder about that now. I'm wondering if that cycle just continues, because you're looking at Black Lives Matter has a very exciting moment, but you wrote a really great piece. Maybe this will get to it, because you wrote a really great piece, Nathan, last week, or June 15th in the American Prospect, and I'll put it in the description for the podcast episode, because I think people that are listening to this would be interested in what you had to say. But the title of it is "When Americans Don't Riot, Politicians Feel Unrestrained," and you gave a kind of historical analysis in which you basically said, like, look, there was a walk back after the civil rights movement and a backlash, and the backlash to the civil rights movement in part succeeded because well, the civil rights organizations and leaders were assassinated and oppressed and attacked by the U.S. government. But also there was a sort of pullback from civil unrest, essentially, that was putting pressure and putting a real material cost on racism and on capitalism. So I thought that was a really interesting moment for you to speak of, especially this one particular point where I know you connect it to you connect it to the Federal Reserve and Alan Greenspan, and this notion that Alan Greenspan and even people who are the economic or financial architects of the United States are noticing that people can actually take unemployment. There's more deprivation, and yet there's not riots. So we can actually deprive them some more. And that lesson is actually something internalized by the system, over the course of the 70s, 80s. I think it's a really brilliant take on it. But I also wonder what you think, what you think that means for right now, because we're sitting on unemployment that seems completely unprecedented, really, it's certainly in our lifetime, in terms of when I really start thinking about it. I think
we're rivaling the Depression at this point.
Yeah, service workers. In fact, you name it, we're looking at several sections, maybe even white-collar employment getting wiped out. Where do we already have civil unrest that's maybe connected more to race than that? But where do you see all these things coming together? Because it seems a really fucking weird moment, man.
Yeah, it is. It is very weird, and I do think that it is a lot. The alternative where there was no unrest is a really dangerous alternative, because that's an alternative where basically people in power can feel like they can just literally do anything at any time for any reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think it's gonna take more, and it's interesting now. I wrote that piece right when rioting was still the word of the day.
Yeah.
And there's still mass protests. We now have the Occupation City Hall in New York. But property destruction, as far as I can tell, has disappeared, and as a result, mainstream press coverage of mass revolt has almost disappeared as well.
That's right.
Not completely.
Yeah.
But we've moved on to the the stage where we're gonna take Cleveland Brown from Family Guy is not gonna be voiced by a white guy anymore. After 20 years, he figures out that actually was not a good idea.
This is that system absorbing this energy. That's what I'm worried about. Because all of a sudden, Joe Biden's wearing a Black Lives Matter mask, and I'm like, oh shit, it's already in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I don't think Black Lives Matter is absorbable.
I hope you're right.
In this way, I think. It will definitely start to be on their lips all the time, but I just don't think it's absorbable in the same way. But I do think that there probably is going to need to be a return to something like those first couple of weeks. The liberals who've managed to convincingly establish this as no, we're trying to find ways to cooperate with the police, yada yada. That has to go away, and you have to actually do stuff that makes this seem like a crisis moment again, and gets coverage of mass protests back on television.
Yeah.
Which they've now demonstrated again only happens when property destruction or some other kind of real serious form of disorder
gotta burn the Wendy's down, man.
Yeah, they're telling you that that this is how it works, because they're, by ignoring your protests now that they're all nice and peaceful and coordinate with the cops, and you get beaten at 6 p.m. on the dot, the way God intended. But and I also think that one of the things that's so dangerous about this moment is the 30, 40 years of basically almost complete total peace, at least from the elite's point of view. It's going to take protracted and sustained efforts to get our very elderly congressional officials to realize what's going on. Nancy Pelosi's 81. There was all this talk about Bernie's age, but Nancy Pelosi's 81, and it shows.
Mm-hmm.
And they just have a policy instinct about how to make policy that is not grounded in feeling constrained by popular uprisings, and it's going to take a while for series of things to happen before the realization suddenly strikes them that they are actually constrained in this way. They've gotten comfortable in their lack of constraints, so it's going to take a lot more to remind them. Whereas if it's 1974, 1975, even a relatively small uprising would finally get Greenspan to back off and be like, okay, we're back to 68. We're back to 65.
Right, yeah.
It's like within their popular memory. I mean, if you live through it, seeing it on the news, and it's relatively recent memory, it's there. Greenspan, these ghouls, even if they seem like from another planet, they live in our society just as much as we do, and they learn the lessons. They pay attention to what's going on, and they, Greenspan. So Greenspan definitely felt much more of a potential constraint to the actions of labor unions and workers and just a general population, even if he's like a much more right-wing figure than these other people, because it's just, there's a social context for everyone's actions, including these people. And, in some sense, Pelosi might, be to Greenspan's left, but it's not in her head at all that she would be constrained.
It seems like the system can more easily respond to right. In other words, the system can easily slide right, but it takes it really, really a lot of pressure to move it left. And you see that, like, I don't know, like, I mean, dudes showed up with guns at these state houses and demanded that they open up the Waffle House. And, like, these places opened up the Waffle House. And, I mean, some of these, like, Michigan lawmakers were running scared and were, like, literally, like, reversing themselves because fucking, like, white dudes showed up with guns. And, like, that part of it is interesting to me because I'm like, okay, they got what they wanted. Like, the literal, like, they got what they wanted because they put pressure with literal violence on these people. And it worked for them. But part of me is, like, also, like, well, that's because those are Republican governments who are ready to move right, and Capitol wants them to move right in a way that, like, moving left is something that takes a lot more popular pressure.
I think that's true, but I also think that the right has repeatedly asserted itself over the past two and a half decades in a way that the left comparatively hasn't. Like, a few, as I talk about in the piece, or I think I talk about in the piece, a few weeks after Martin Luther King's assassination and the associated riots, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act.
That's right.
And yes, that's partially rooted in the rebellion happening, but it's also partially rooted in the rebellions that had happened before and the social pressure of the moment that, that same level of pressure wouldn't lead to action now because, the policymakers, political elites, now aren't quote unquote educated, in the way that, those riots and rebellions and those political leaders educated the political elites. I mean, you can think of that in one way. We do need, economic literacy. We do need political literacy, but it's not so much among individuals. It is of actually educating the political elites, and that's a lot of what social movements do. Is they teach you, okay, you do this, we will do this. You do X, we will do Y, and educating the political elites about the constraints that they are under is just not something that our social movements, have been doing lately. I think Black Lives Matter is the first one that really has come closest to doing it, and has also sustained a series of militant actions that I think, with some amount of years, or depending on how much of the cool zone we experience over the next year, then it really has that possibility. But you do need that sort of education. I think, and to me, the biggest weakness that the left has is to the extent that we have any political figures in public, any political figures who can get on television to deliver a message, they all repeat some whitewashed version of like Martin Luther King or Gandhi nonviolence. Like, none of them can go even so far as repeating what Martin Luther King had to say about riots, and he very clearly was trying to educate political elites about what an alternative was to what the alternative was to his social democratic program, and unfortunately that alternative fell away as the rioting fell away. But I think that's our biggest weakness, is we don't have anyone to forthrightly say the alternative to riots is to do X, Y, and Z, and you actually have to follow through on these policies. The closest we get is no justice, no peace, which I think communicates it in a way that people on television haven't been communicating it.
No justice, no peace is kind of a very basic way of saying what I think you're saying, which is that, and I love this point, is that the kind of an important role of a social movement would be to sort of articulate the landscape of possibilities to political elites and let them know that there are consequences for not considering these policies. And that's a great way of thinking about it. And I wonder what you think about it in terms of the larger history, because I know you think a lot about the New Deal and sort of that sort of economic and social policies in the mid-century period and after. But there's a common story that people tell about the New Deal, with the bonus march and everything like that like FDR saved capitalism. There was going to be a rebellion, because there was such poverty and unemployment in the country, and that's a story we tell a lot. That policies were made to basically avoid the consequences, the scary consequences of a huge lot of unemployed people. Do you see that logic at all in the Democratic Party? In other words, it seems like what you're saying is they don't fear that anymore. They don't fear an uprising, although in the last few weeks, that's probably why it's so exciting. We're actually seeing that maybe they should.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting things about the New Deal is that is in certain respects true, but part of what made the New Deal able to be responsive is that it had a left wing and a right wing. It had a right wing that definitely was thinking in terms of saving capitalism, but it also had a left wing that was thinking in terms of greater democratic possibilities, and they were also part of the administrative apparatus at the time. Eventually you get to the Popular Front,
right?
In retrospect, it's easy to see, New Deal was just about saving capitalism, and then everything fell apart. But I would say that the second Red Scare and purging the administrative state was an important part of making sure that the only thing that remained was the right wing of the New Deal and things that were further right. And I think that even post World War II, you see in these moments, like through the Employment Act of 1945, that there is a possibility for something else that was germinating, and it was a contingent fact that moment fell apart. Partially because Jim Crow was still so powerful in the country that as a colleague David Stein says, there was a Jim Crow monetary policy, a Jim Crow economic policy, and a Jim Crow economic apparatus was able to that was strong enough to crush the the creation of things like the Full Employment Act of 1945 and its kind of much stronger provisions. But it won, but it won by just not that much. And then the launch of kind of the Cold War and the purging of the American state was a multi-year process that made it not only just that people were taken out of the state, but that anyone who could possibly consider wanting to transform the economy or make it more democratic would be afraid to participate. People like Leon K. Sterling, who was Truman's head of his Council of Economic Advisors, basically resigns so that not to get the scrutiny of the anti-communist witch hunt. So that's what I would highlight, and then and I think that does have a lesson for us today in that there is no similar figures in our government. Our government has stayed purged of anyone who could broadly be sympathetic to democratizing the economy for the most part, with the exception of like a few Congress people the last few years, and then Bernie. And the administrative state has definitely been kept free of those kinds of influences, and I think that's a big part of why the government is so much less responsive. If that was like actually a junior partner to the governing coalition, even as a junior partner, it would exert a lot more influence over what's going on. But the government has been very successfully purged basically since the 50s of such figures.
Yeah.
And so it is just much harder to move, and then the only thing that could be there is just sort of your own feeling of feeling constrained by unrest. And as I was saying, so much of the leadership across the government are not those kinds of people, or aren't taking that seriously because it's been so long since they can even remember the left being a threat that it's a college dalliance really. Then it's very hard to turn the ship around.
It's so weird. I mean, for us to understand that, a college dalliance, because you have the right thinks that the left has taken over the universities and is all Marxist professors who are indoctrinating the kids into Marxism and things like that. So it's like this, but the perceptions of different layers of reality is kind of crazy to me. And I was thinking about, while you were speaking there, about the New Deal and like going back and thinking about widespread policies of, social engineering, like the Federal Housing Authority, which was like in the first 30 years of the FHA, like 98% of their loans went to white people. And so it's like, there's this question. I wonder what it does to us in 2020 because, the left, and when I say the left, I mean, who the fuck knows what that is? I mean, there's a collection of like different, like, I think when people say the left, they mean maybe a couple podcasts in Brooklyn and like a few like different magazines and things like that. But when you think about the left's like kind of coalescing around Bernie politics in 2019, 2020, it's like there was a lot of people who were saying, well, hold on, those processes of redistribution in history have not really been fair racially, and like part of that is like was part of like Bernie's racial weakness, was like really this like class versus race conversation that got really stupid. But I wonder what happens to that conversation. And I'm speculating with you. I invite you to speculate with me, because I wonder what happens to that conversation, because it's all of a sudden it seems like, race is sort of like the way in for a lot of people. You know what I mean? Like race becomes the like sort of way into left politics for people, totally away from this sort of like New Deal politics that this sort of like Brooklyn left had been really kind of hitting hard over the last few years.
Well, I mean, that's what's interesting to me about it, though, is, I mean, the civil rights movement in a lot of ways is like a radicalized, purified strand of New Deal politics. It is the left wing of the New Deal who, noticed, all those ways in which particular programs of the New Deal benefited and were targeted specifically to white people, but also saw other sorts of benefits and other sorts of democratic possibilities for themselves, especially in the North, which we have to remember was, had a Jim Crow of its own, which, New Deal processes helped, deconstruct, at least to a certain extent, at that time period, and they were always on pushing the forefront of those politics, and also during the New Deal, and then of course during World War II, saw the possibilities of solidarity in full employment.
Right.
And the movement become for the double V-Day, both victory abroad and victory at home, and A. Philip Randolph and the figures, the transitional figures from that period in the 30s and the New Deal to the civil rights movement in a lot of ways is like a culmination and a development of New Deal politics, and they draw lessons from some of the most radical elements of the New Deal, like things around direct job creation and seeing poverty as not the fault of an individual, but actually a systematic lack of jobs. they're real radical ideas about guaranteeing jobs, which become and provisioning and socially provisioning people with the necessities of life that get carried into and get carried forward by the civil rights movement as it gets purged everywhere else. And as liberals swing to the right. So to me, what's so interesting and kind of strange about this sort of white left's focus or dalliance with the New Deal and Bernie, and then this race and class conversation is the way it's separated from that history in which the children of the New Deal or one of the best fruits that the New Deal bore for the left is a fruition and a flowering of the civil rights movement. And this is actually as much as like a certain version of the white left or predominantly white left wants to take claim to these different figures, it's been black left organizations who have carried forward these biggest ideals of the New Deal and then the civil rights movement. Black Youth Project 100 and the movement of Black Lives, they're the people who have had job guarantee in their founding documents and talk about it a lot more. That are in their programs and they talk about it a lot more. It's always been there among the left. You'll occasionally hear it get mentioned in Jacobin, but it's not at all like a central point or plank that gets pointed to in people's politics. And if you come to the job guarantee or start advocating the job guarantee in a way that doesn't fit conventional white left understandings of what the left is, people will be very open, very happy to publish a whole set of critiques that isn't grounded in this civil rights history.
Right.
And I think and I think for me, what's interesting about this moment is the black left taking the stage and it becoming very clear that they have a very clear and direct economic program, which in a lot of ways fits what I'm interested in much more than what I've been hearing from kind of official sites of the left trademarked.
I agree.
Until the coronavirus suppression happens. I mean, that's what's interesting to me. Hearing figures and hearing organizations like Survived and Punished, and others talk about defunding the police and talking about abolition and talking about providing and redirecting funds towards care and community. I mean, I think these things are accessible more broadly, but they also kind of more directly fit what I'm interested in and have the kind of antagonistic relationship with the state, but also understanding that there is resources and power there that we need to take. Essentially, having the kind of ambivalent feeling about the state that I'm interested in.
Yeah, totally. That ambivalent thing about the state is, I think, something that was always missing to me from the, Jacobin crowd or whatever. Is that not only ambivalence but like real skepticism about the state, and I'm not a person that really like calls myself an ist of anything, an anarchist or a Marxist or anything, in part because I can see value in pieces of a lot of those traditions, but at the same time, like, the state really scares the shit out of me. I mean, I studied the Vietnam War, and like the state is just basically an actor in a genocide in that context, and so the idea of empowering the state has always been something that I've been skeptical about, and I think you're right when I think back, at least, on my the sort of radical education, I guess. I mean, the voices that really appealed to me coming out of the 60s and 70s are often like black anti-capitalists, because not because of the kind of content of their racial critique, which you actually hear that from white people too. It's more that the connection of the racial critique to the anti-capitalism and the anti-statism, even, because they're people that are explaining the sort of that ambivalence of the state. The state has been both our greatest liberator and our greatest oppressor, and that part of it is really tricky to navigate. But figures like Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and Angela Davis and so many others that really it's amazing to see people discovering these voices right now. Like more and more, like I'm hearing like people like, in the mainstream talking about, I mean, I just finished a course about the suburbs, and as a population of older people that are in the class, so they're all like in their 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and like they had never heard about redlining before, and so like we did a little unit on redlining, and like all of them were just fucking minds blown. And what was amazing about it is, to me, is like they were all like liberals. They're all people that were like, oh well, I'm very concerned about racism, but they never had really connected like what to them racism is exactly what you're speaking of. It's kind of like, well, racism is when like a white guy voices Cleveland on the fucking Family Guy, rather than racism being like a set of like structures and policies that like limit what people can actually do materially in their lives. That's new in the conversation, dude. Like that's weird that there's more of a mainstream conversation about that stuff, and I credit Black Lives Matter for bringing it, but it's, again, who knows where this energy goes. It seems like a really wacky moment still.
Yeah, I mean, and things are just distorted because in the same time as people are trying to revolt, I mean, they're also experiencing deaths in their personal life, in their family, and they're, scared about what's going on. They're scared about, where they're going to get their future livelihood. So, it's a moment where it can go in a lot of different directions very rapidly, and also depends, depending on what the government does in the next month or so.
That's what I was going to ask you about, sort of the survival element of it, because we talk about a lot, like, well, things won't really change in America until like people are really fighting for their survival. You see that, right? Like you can really see that in Black Lives Matter. There are people that are like, it's life and death, and it seems like the pandemic like adds a life and death element for everyone. And you, on top of that is, on top of the health issue is employment, and I'm wondering, in your utopian dream, what would you do at this moment in terms of employment? Because it seems like, the $1,200, thing happened once. I don't see them doing that again. I have no idea. But it also, like, part of me is like, I don't know what the end game is of like unemployment being this fucking insane. Uprisings happening in cities partially because of it. It seems like the system will like want to do something. I don't know. It seems like a part of me is like really just has a hard time figuring out what's next. I think that's what all of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's from my reading of it, Congress has been amazingly aloof.
Yeah.
I've as a result of some of my recent success, I've more in my day-to-day life, having conversations with congressional staffers. And such, and so I'm getting a little bit more of a window into that world than I did before, which I did have somewhat. And
are you becoming a wonk, Nathan? Are you becoming a policy wonk?
Well, I've always been a wonk. I mean, that's always been kind of my ambivalent position. Is I've
that's what I love about you, because you're such a left person, and you're also like so articulate and knowledgeable about policy that it's like I don't want to flatter you or make you feel embarrassed or anything, but I think you're a really important figure that's kind of straddling these places, like on the radical left, but also talking to Congress. So what is happening in there?
Yeah, I know it's a very weird position. I have so depending on when this is out, is when it'll be out or not. But there's actually a reporter at Bloomberg Business Week is doing a profile on me.
Yes.
And
cool.
And it's very bizarre and kind of surreal because like to have that as also. I'm a left figure, as you just talking about, published, a piece about how, when Americans don't riot, politicians feel unrestrained, like a couple of weeks ago. Like, I'm very much, kind of have these two lanes where I'm commenting on very technical economic policy stuff that gets people interested in me, but I'm also, I'm not particularly shy about being a radical leftist.
We love it.
And so, it's a weird moment where you can kind of straddle these worlds, and that's part of why I think things are breaking down in a way.
Yeah.
Because normally this kind of thing wouldn't be possible, but things are so mixed up and so thrown around, and conventional ideologies are breaking down to such an extent that like people aren't particularly focused and worried about it, because they're just much more worried about urgently what's going on, what's happening in the next week or month or so. But from that vantage point, you can tell a lot about Congress depending on when it does unscheduled things or not. Like when Congress decide, one of the ways you can know that the 2008 financial crisis was really, really important was you having these sudden crises where all of Congress would rush back to Congress and cut a recess short. And what's remarkable about this period is how much there hasn't been that. How much, the riots happening, and people ask, congressional people or congressional staffers whether Congress is going to reconvene early to respond to what's happening. And, literally, like I saw one reporter, Jeff Stein from the Washington Post, say that basically like someone texted him back a laugh crying emoji when he asked that question. It's just because the idea is so ridiculous, but also scary how ridiculous that idea is. And, Congress really has not been on the ball. We have a whole bunch of programs, the kind of sort of basic programs that are supposed to sustain things like, for example, those expanded unemployment insurance benefits, the extra $600 a week, which expires at the end of July. That's not that long ago. That's from now. That's a month from now, basically.
Yeah.
It's a month from now, and it's not at all clear to me that they're going to extend it. That it's going to be extended as is. I suspect there's a push to change it because a whole bunch of people are outraged that a low wage person could possibly get more from their unemployment benefits than from their jobs. God forbid. That's the most important critical problems that the United States is facing right now, and it's not 100% clear to me that those are going to get extended, let alone anything else. I mean, with the state and local governments across the country are in total crisis right now. The Federal Reserve has launched a facility to deal with that, but it's really wildly inadequate. And the money that the federal government is putting up is nowhere near enough. I mean, the way you can tell how bad things are is Timothy Geithner in a recent report, which I wrote about, his proposals, as inadequate as they are for giving money to state and local governments, is much, much more generous than anything I've seen discussed anywhere near Congress.
Oh, God.
Because just recognizing just how big a scope that part of the crisis is, and there is no one who's even considered in Congress fully making up the depression-related budgetary shortfalls for state and local governments. There's no proposal from anywhere near the Congress that has made a proposal like that. There's some weird out there lefty people that I know who have made proposals of that and been able to get a little bit of attention towards it. But I might be the most prominent person who's pushed fully putting state.
It seems like we started off thinking about Obama as like a significant architect of the election. It seems like from what I'm reading that and this is a strategy that maybe all of us would think is a smart one, is that Biden should basically keep his mouth shut and try and make the whole election a referendum on Trump, which is it makes me think about the 2016 election a lot, because it ends up being like just counting on people hating Trump. But there's also like it doesn't seem like there's a lot of policy coming from Biden. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot in terms of, especially
they're specifically not interested in putting in policy. They do have policy teams. The policy teams are secret.
Yeah.
They're not. You're not supposed to out yourself as being involved or.
That's so fucking crazy.
Or out anyone else that's involved.
Yeah.
So for all anyone knows, I'm involved.
But no, I mean, in terms of relief, like in terms of like what relief might Americans get, it's kind of like totally a mystery.
He's been putting up stuff that's basically like Trump's rhetoric, which maybe like with more technically competent stuff underneath. But his stuff has been like how to reopen safer. It hasn't been about like a comprehensive economic program put forward to respond fiscally. I'd be interested to see. The thing I just mentioned is coming out of the Aspen Institute, which is a very establishment think tank, and has a lot of big names associated, like Timothy Geithner, and the Treasury Secretary under Obama. And I am interested to see if something comes out in July.
Yeah.
Because it does seem like these kind of people putting something like this out, that's in dialogue with whatever's going on with the Biden camp.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like these big policies that were going to be like Bernie policies that Elizabeth Warren was about, like specifically like the big ones were like what, Medicare for all and canceling or forgiving student loans. Like, I wonder what happened to that one, because part of me. And I defer to your expertise on this one, but from what I've heard, there come a time where, like, I don't know, canceling student loans might make economic sense, right? In other words, there might be.
I think it makes a ton of sense. I mean, that was one of the things Trump actually. First things Trump did was suspend principal and interest payments on student loans.
Right, exactly.
And so it's like that went from like his crazy radical leftist thing to something that like almost Trump like went forward with.
Like the housing industry, like we were talking about, like houses, like people can't, a whole generation of people can't buy houses because they're strapped to these student loans and all the debt. And it's like, well, wouldn't the housing industry have an interest in eliminating student loans so the housing industry can come back?
Well, that makes me just think about the Obama administration a lot, because we heard all these things about what couldn't be done and what couldn't be done.
Yeah,
and it turns out actually suspending foreclosures on any property with a government guaranteed loan was on the table. I mean, you couldn't do comprehensive suspensions of foreclosures, but you could get a lot of the way. And there's also foreclosures that happened in a lot of Democratic states that could have been dealt with. You can suspended foreclosures in a lot of ways, suspended evictions, foreclosure evictions, and tenant evictions. There were apparently a lot of things that that there was executive discretion about in 2009, 2010, which, by the way, would have won a lot of people a lot of elections.
No shit.
That didn't happen. And so I think that's one of the lessons of this crisis is more often than not, when they tell you they can't do something, they're lying to you. And that's that this crisis has made that truth about the Obama administration, about the Democratic Party, from the last crisis, even more glaringly true this time around. But yeah, I mean, we're there's a lot of things that could be done to help people make rent. A lot of sending people $1,200 checks. Like the thing about that's maddening about the $1,200 check thing is and deciding to send it on a more regular basis, God forbid monthly, is that kind of emergency cash payment thing. That's not really about the household. From an economic point of view, that's not really about the household. Yes, it helps them pay the bills, it keeps them afloat. That's great, but from an economic reason, the capitalist reason you send out emergency cash payments is so that they can pay their bill, so the people that they pay can pay their bill, and so on, and keeps this network of cash payments going. Those landlords can then pay their mortgages, and so on. That's why you send out emergency cash payments.
That's what I'm thinking.
It sustains the structure of the system as it is. The less, one of the first things, this is actually probably like the first thing I wrote on the Substack is, fundamentally what's happened is that incomes have collapsed. Nominal incomes have collapsed. Mm-hmm. They've collapsed both for businesses, both for households, and for state and local governments. So the way you deal with that is either you have to lower their outflows, you have to suspend the debt payments that they need to make, or so on and so forth, or you need to increase their cash inflows. You need to get money to them, and you need to get money to them quickly. Those are your two options. You either do two of them. You don't have a third choice, really. You either lower the outflows smoothly or painfully, or you increase the inflows smoothly or painfully. And cash payments are a very smooth way to do it and make that network of payments get going again. And but that's not really how people are thinking about it.
They're thinking about it in terms of just relief. I think you're right. And that's what I was trying to get at, was that like there's this sense of like that the left is often kind of touchy-feely and like, oh, that $1,200 is about like keeping, you know, grandma well-fed and the house warm and all that kind of stuff. But there's also just like the raw kind of keeping the quote-unquote economy moving part of it, which is like putting money in people's pockets to keep that money going out of their house to the things that like are moving those pieces. And that part of it seems like really, again, not really part of the conversation. I wonder, because it's like what you're saying, and this might be a way to wrap this up, because it seems like it connects to your piece in the American Prospect, which is that shit gets done in an emergency. Like, shit gets done when there's a crisis. And usually, ordinary people don't benefit from that. Like, usually capitalism benefits from that. But what you're saying, and I think, I might be paraphrasing you, but like, kind of like, you know, we can, like, the role of the left and the role of social movements might be to, like, create the crisis and, like, maybe we might be able to control it a little bit, like, be the emergency, if that makes sense. Because it seems like...
Yeah, I mean... I think to be the emergency, but also the source of ideas that can be defended. I mean, a lot of what, you know, we don't like to think about it this way, but a lot of what capitalists gets by is a plausible ideology that is vaguely convincing to people, and and it's a rigged game in the sense that, you know, establishment figures are always better prepared to debate on their turf than other people, but it actually is a game you can play, and a lot of the justifications, a lot of the ways that reigning ideologies defended themselves have been collapsing the last 5 or 10 years, and the left actually is in a good position and has a set of ideas, a network of people that could be put together to put counter ideas out there, and it's a lot harder to keep the system going when you consistently win the argument, and you know and you still lose the policy. You know, it still happens. You know, you still need, you know, material forces, as it were, on your side. You still need, you know, the uprisings. You still need the riots. But it also, you know, changes how people are feeling about what's going on when, you know, when people feel like, oh no, this X, Y, and Z is clearly right. I clearly do need, you know, it does actually make sense to put cash in my pocket right now. They're just not doing it. Is really important. And I think and I think you need to be able to, like, bring that case to those spaces, and, you know, that's obviously part of, you know, I'm biased in that way, in that sense that has been a motivating factor for me for a lot of years now. You know, a lot of what I've been interested in has been writing pieces in the Financial Times and, you know, going on a Bloomberg podcast to make the case in specific granular ways that ultimately lead to a left-wing conclusion. You know, I don't just go on the Bloomberg podcast and go, like, you know, socialism now, socialism forever, or socialism or barbarism.
Yeah, right.
But you do get to a granular work your way to the points where some government institution is picking winners and losers, and they're picking winners and losers not to the benefit of, you know, the working class, or not to the benefit of ordinary people, or against you know, marginalized groups like black people in this country, and that, you know, being able to end the conversation on those points and point that there is an alternative that just isn't being used, isn't being tapped, you know, helps make that case for that point, and leads something, a nagging question or nagging doubt in people's minds much longer than a slogan does. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's such a learning moment for the left, and the left, so much, and I think, you know, part of this is important too, but so much of the left's program has been about, like, education, but, like, kind of educating each other, you know, and educating, like, you know, other members of the public. And I love your take on, like, okay, that's great, but we also need to, like, educate elites, and educate the elites in very specific ways, and bring them over without just kind of getting on there with the kind of same old slogans. And that part, that's a really great point. Yeah, they're always the enemy, but they need to be aware of the danger. You know, the Iraq War, one of the big first things is that sort of moment that people talk about, the fear up moment, where you show pictures of how gigantic the guns are, and that there is no alternative. This is what's coming, and that's what makes the actual moment so much worse. Well, it's time to fear up for the elites, and also point out that there is an alternative that will be a little nicer for you. But there is no alternative to that. There's no way to piece things together in a way that is beneficial to your conventional categories. And one way or another, power needs to be transferred and resources need to be reallocated. And
the left has always had the better ideas, but we've talked a lot, and I know you're one of these people who talks a lot about that word power. I'm glad you just mentioned it, because it's really, okay, we can have the best ideas, but how do we actually get them to work? And I'm glad that you're spending a lot of time thinking about that, Nathan. Thanks so much for explaining this stuff to us. This is always really fun to talk to you. I really appreciate it.
Sounds good.
Take care. All right, I want to thank Nathan Tankus. I always have a wonderful time talking with him. I hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation. His Substack is called Notes on the Crises. That's the thing that everybody's talking about. Go check that out. And if you want to subscribe to it, Nathan was kind enough to set up a deep discount for Nostalgia Trap listeners. So go to nostalgiatrap.com and you can look at the episode description, which will have that link. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, supporters of the Nostalgia Trap. If you want to join our club, do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We always appreciate the support. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.